You're standing in the throne room of Memphis, sometime around 2250 BCE, watching the most powerful human being on Earth. A 6-year-old boy named Pepi II stare at naked slaves coated in honey while insects devour them alive. This isn't cruelty for entertainment. This is research. And what he discovered about human fear would help him rule for 94 years, the longest verified reign in human history, by mastering something Egyptian texts called the divine silence. The systematic use of terror so precisely calibrated that it didn't need to be spoken, only witnessed. Listen carefully to what the palace records actually say. The pyramid texts and scattered administrative documents from Pepi II's reign contain references to observers of trembling, recorders of the breath that stops, and students of the face that cannot speak. Egyptologists have dismissed these as religious metaphors or poetic descriptions of divine power. But when you cross-reference these terms with architectural evidence, burial records, and the physical layout of his mortuary complex, something far more disturbing emerges. Pepi II wasn't just a pharaoh. He was an experimental psychologist 23 centuries before psychology existed as a discipline. The honey-covered slaves appear in fragmentary hieratic texts discovered at Saqqara in the 1980s, records so disturbing that they remain under-translated in museum storage because no scholar wanted to be associated with publishing them. But the details that have leaked describe systematic observations, how long before screaming begins, how the body contorts when escape is impossible, at what point the eyes stop tracking movement, when bowel control fails, how breathing changes as hope dies. These weren't random torture sessions. They were controlled experiments with scribes recording physiological responses in meticulous detail. The insects, specifically a species of flesh-eating beetle native to the Nile Delta, were chosen because they consumed living tissue slowly enough to observe progressive stages of agony while keeping the subject conscious. Read that again. A child pharaoh was studying the biomechanics of fear with scientific precision. Why? Because Pepi II inherited the throne during a period of catastrophic instability. The Old Kingdom was fragmenting. Regional governors were becoming warlords. The Nile's flood cycles were failing. Famine was spreading. Traditional displays of power, military conquest, monumental building projects, religious pageantry were losing their effectiveness. The population had seen too much death to fear ordinary violence. They'd watched their children starve. They'd buried entire families. Conventional intimidation had stopped working. So Pepi II, or more accurately, his regent mother Ankhesenet Pepi II, and the priesthood that controlled him, developed something new, a system of terror so psychologically sophisticated that it bypassed rational thought entirely and triggered primal, uncontrollable physiological responses that made resistance impossible. Here's where the evidence gets fragmented but undeniable. The palace complex at Memphis was redesigned during Pepi II's early reign to include what architectural surveys identify as observation chambers, rooms with deliberate sightlines that forced visitors approaching the throne to witness specific scenes before entering the pharaoh's presence. Modern archaeologists assume these were ceremonial spaces or waiting rooms, but the positioning is too precise. The acoustics are too carefully engineered, and the drainage systems notice this detail. The drainage systems beneath these chambers are designed to channel fluids away from viewing areas while maintaining visibility of the central platform. These were theaters, stages, laboratories where human suffering was performed for an audience that would then carry that terror directly into negotiations with a 6-year-old god king who sat perfectly still, perfectly silent, watching them with the same detached curiosity he'd turned on the honey-covered slaves. The fragmentary texts call this the divine silence. The state induced in witnesses who had seen suffering so absolute that speech became impossible, not forbidden, impossible. The body's stress response was so overwhelming that the neurological pathways controlling language shut down. Modern neuroscience calls this selective mutism induced by acute trauma. The Egyptians called it proof of divine power, and they weaponized it. But here's what historians rarely mention, because it complicates our comfortable narratives about ancient Egypt. It worked catastrophically well. Regional governors who arrived at Memphis planning rebellion left as loyal servants. Priests who questioned temple allocations suddenly supported every decree. Foreign emissaries who came to negotiate returned home advising immediate surrender. and Pepi II ruled longer than any verified monarch in human history, maintaining absolute control even as the kingdom collapsed around him. The inscriptions describe his presence differently than any other pharaoh. Where earlier rulers are depicted as warriors, builders, or gods, Pepi II is consistently shown as the one who sees, the still observer, he who knows the breath. His mortuary texts contain prayers asking that he not turn his gaze upon the supplicant, not his wrath, his gaze. Because the machinery of terror he'd developed didn't require action. It required only the threat of observation, the memory of what observation had meant for others. Understand the machinery here. Traditional power requires constant violence, endless demonstrations of force that exhaust resources and eventually inspire resistance. But psychological terror, true weaponized trauma, creates a self-sustaining system. One public demonstration of absolute suffering creates 1,000 witnesses. Those witnesses carry the memory into 1,000 interactions. The fear replicates itself without requiring additional violence. The system becomes efficient, sustainable, invisible. The administrative records from Pepi II's later reign show something extraordinary. Crime rates plummeted. Tax compliance became nearly perfect. Labor requisitions were met without resistance. Not because conditions improved, agricultural yields were declining, famine was worsening, but because the population had internalized a terror so profound that disobedience became neurologically impossible for most people. The divine silence wasn't just what happened to witnesses in those observation chambers. It was the state of an entire society conditioned to police itself through traumatic memory. Now follow this thread carefully because it connects to something we're still living with. The techniques Pepi II's regime developed didn't die with the Old Kingdom. They appear again in Assyrian psychological warfare, documented in royal annals describing precise methodologies for inducing mass trauma. They surface in Roman triumph ceremonies designed not to celebrate victory, but to traumatize populations into submission. They're codified in medieval torture manuals that read less like punishment guidelines and more like experimental protocols testing human psychological limits. And they appear, with disturbing frequency, in 20th century intelligence agency documents on enhanced interrogation and psychological operations that use nearly identical language to describe physiological stress responses. The knowledge never disappeared. It evolved, it professionalized, it became institutional. Here's what makes Pepi II's experiments particularly significant. He proved that fear could be studied systematically, that human psychological responses to trauma follow predictable patterns, and that these patterns could be exploited to maintain power without constant physical violence. He demonstrated that the most effective control isn't what you do to people, it's what you make them witness, what you force them to carry in their memory, what you condition them to fear might happen if they resist. The honey-covered slaves weren't punished criminals. The texts are clear on this. They were selected specifically because they'd committed no offense, because witnesses needed to understand that suffering wasn't connected to behavior. It was arbitrary, unpredictable. It could happen to anyone at any time for no reason. That's what made it effective. Justice can be avoided through compliance, but arbitrary terror destroys the psychological foundation that makes resistance possible. Read the burial records from Memphis during Pepi II's reign. Notice how many show signs of stress-induced illness. Teeth ground to stumps, stress fractures in bones from chronic muscle tension, stomach ulcerations visible in preserved tissue. An entire population was living in a physiological state of constant activation, their bodies marinating in cortisol and adrenaline, their immune systems compromised, their life expectancy shortened. The divine silence wasn't just psychological, it was biological, and Pepi II learned all of this before he turned 7 years old. What the historical record shows, when you look at it honestly, when you stop romanticizing ancient Egypt as a civilization of wisdom and mysticism, is that a child was taught to view human suffering as data, that a government systematized trauma as policy, and that this approach to power was so successful that it sustained a regime through 94 years of environmental catastrophe, economic collapse, and political fragmentation. The uncomfortable truth isn't that ancient Egyptians were uniquely cruel. It's that they were uniquely effective at documenting their cruelty. And we've inherited those documents without fully confronting what they reveal about the relationship between knowledge and power. If you're watching this, subscribe to Mythbusting because we're not here to make ancient history comfortable. We're here to make it honest. The divine silence wasn't divine, it was engineered. And the fact that similar systems keep appearing throughout history, that governments keep rediscovering these same principles that torture manuals from different centuries read like they're plagiarizing each other, suggests something we desperately don't want to believe, that there's a reproducible science to breaking human will, that it's been tested and refined across millennia, and that its effectiveness doesn't depend on primitive ignorance, but on sophisticated understanding of exactly how human neurology responds to witnessing absolute suffering. Pepi II's regime collapsed eventually. The old kingdom fell. But the knowledge didn't die. It went underground, preserved in priestly schools, military academies, intelligence services, any institution where power needed to be maintained efficiently and resistance needed to be prevented systematically. We like to think we've evolved beyond such primitive barbarism, but the machinery is still here. The language has changed. The methods have been refined. The documentation is classified rather than carved in stone. But the fundamental principle Pepi II proved in those observation chambers 22 centuries before Christ, that witnessed suffering creates a silence more absolute than any law, that principle remains operational. The question isn't whether we're capable of such systematic cruelty. History proves we are. The question is whether we're willing to recognize it when it's happening, when it's wrapped in institutional language and legal justification and claims of necessity. Because the divine silence isn't just historical, it's a technology. And like all technologies, it doesn't disappear, it just gets rebranded. So leave a comment. What other uncomfortable historical truths are we avoiding because the implications are too disturbing to confront?